Won't be long now. Jim Rawles from somewhere west of Nebraska, south of Canada, and north of Nevada. He's on his way. He's got that bear tallow from the Grizzlies in there in his Sherman tank treads. It's all greased up good. It's moving along like a top. 35 miles an hour. It's picking up speed. Yep, it's on its way. Jim Rawles is almost here.
You're listening to Quorum Radio on WRMI 5850 kilohertz.
Quorum Radio, baby. At Quorum Radio, now on with James Rawles. And you probably know who he is, but we're going to tell you a little bit more about him. He's an American author, a best-selling author who writes survivalist genre Patriots novel series. Rawles is a former. He's also got a book that just came out. It's just coming out now. It's debuting at #1 practically, and available only at Costco until mid-October. It's called The Ultimate Prepper Survival Guide. And that is a book you want to get. You want to get something, a great Christmas gift. Get it now at Costco. Don't pussyfoot around. Go for it now. It is going to disappear. Okay, they do special stuff. They know that Jim Rawles has excellent books, and it will go quickly. So without further ado, well, Quorum Radio welcomes you, Jim. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, Bill.
It's my pleasure. Okay, well, first thing I want to ask you is I do want you to give me just like a 60-second summary on the Ultimate Prepper Survival Guide. Tell us about why this book is different from previous editions of your prepper books and why it's special for 2020.
Well, sure. It's actually my 11th book, and it's my 4th nonfiction book. And this one's unusual in that it's not designed as an introductory book for newbie preppers. It's really more of an advanced book, and it goes into great detail on what people need to do to be absolutely prepared for an economic collapse or for a major pandemic. And it really delves into the real nitty-gritty of preparedness.
Right. And so and by the way, this book, I was looking at it on Amazon. I couldn't see much on it on the details. How many pages is it, can I ask?
It's 240 pages in a large format, and there's a glossary in the back, and my notorious list of lists is in the back as well.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, good. Well, let me ask you a question about 2020. I don't think that in 2015, we thought that in 5 years we'd be looking at a situation this tumultuous. I just say tumultuous.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was on the phone the other day with a friend who was director of security at American Airlines on 9/11. He's a remarkable guy. I call him the Forrest Gump of law enforcement, Larry Wansley. And he cannot believe how absolutely just unprecedented the situation is in terms of tension in the country. What's your comment about
our world really has been turned upside down. Back in January, I posted a piece in my blog saying that 2020 might be the year of perfect hindsight, 2020 hindsight. I had no idea that our world would be turned completely upside down, that there would be such a great loss of individual liberty in just a few months' time, that the world would be locked down, that we'd see a booming economy turned into a stagnant economy, and that we'd see such huge social turmoil. None of that could really be fully foreseen, but in my writings, I've been doing Survival Blog for 15 years now, I've been warning people that any number of things could happen. I just didn't expect them to all happen in 1 year.
Oh, it's astonishing. And not only that, it happened in question of weeks.
Yes. Yeah, all the things that they teased preppers and survivalists about, like storing large quantities of food and toilet paper and personal protective gear, all those things turned out to be needed all within just a few weeks. So
Yeah,
nobody's
amazing.
really laughing at preppers now.
No, they're jealous of preppers now. And they're saying, why the heck did we think of this stuff? You know, they're the smart guys. You know, they're the smart guys on the block. But of course, you know, they're the guys that want to keep flying under the wire. They want to keep a low profile. Do you talk about that a lot in your books? Because, you know, obviously we've seen
in fact,
Rod Serling.
I have a whole little section in my book about being what's called the gray man, where you basically try to blend in and not let people know that you're a prepper, because obviously if you're anywhere outside of a very lightly populated area, if it becomes known that you're preparedness-minded, people are going to assume that you have all the logistics to go along with it, and that actually raises your profile and your risk of being cleaned out by looters if and when things do hit the fan.
Absolutely. Not only that, but people who simply know that, hey, man, this is going to be over in 30 days, so just give me what you got. We're going to starve otherwise, right? So there you go.
Yeah, and there's kind of an inverse correlation. You know, the worse the situation is, the less hesitancy that the bad guys are going to come knocking on your door, because if they think it's a total wipeout and that law enforcement is not going to resume anytime soon, they'll figure, oh, well, he's now high priority to go clean out his stockpile, clean out his larder, and at that point, if you're not in a well-prepared group that has 24/7 security and 360-degree security, a perimeter, then you really are quite at great risk. So it is important to keep low profile. In the military, we use what's called the need-to-know rule. You keep a low profile. Only tell those people who really need to know about your preparations, and even those people probably shouldn't get the whole story.
So, of course, that begs the question. Most of us have a family, which either means, you know, parents maybe living nearby or under the same roof, or you have kids. And that's a big, big issue because, you know, with kids, you know, if they find out something, they can share it with their friends.
Kids can be taught from an early age to be circumspect. You know, in my case, I live under an assumed name, and we raised our kids knowing both family names, and they never let it slip. So it can be done. It's just a matter of teaching your children properly the importance of privacy and of, you know, what you reveal to who and under what circumstances. They can be trusted if you raise them right.
Yeah, it's a question also of seeing a good example from mom and dad that they don't talk about stuff that's not necessary to discuss, not just preparedness-related issues, but anything for that matter. It comes up when it's necessary to be discussed. It's discussed. It's not going to be done. You're not going to brag about it. Like, hey, I've got probably 100 times more, detergent and bleach than anybody in the county. You're not going to tell them that. You know, that's fun. Okay, Dad. Well, I don't know why you're doing that, Dad, but my kids are going to think it's cool, man. We're going to come over here for science experiments. You know. So, probably not a scenario that happens with Jim Rawles, but of course, you know, those are the types of outcomes you don't want to have. So is there a group of people that under the category of preppers who live in, advanced preppers, okay, because this book is for advanced preppers, that are in that category that live in urban locations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of my readers are in that category, and it actually requires a higher level of preparedness to be in an urban area, because if you have to hunker down for an extended period of time in an urban area, the depth of the logistics that you're going to need is that much greater. And obviously, the only gardening that you're going to be doing is, maybe doing sprouts in your cupboards. So you need to have more storage food than someone who lives out in the country. Someone who lives, as I do, out in the hinterboonies, we do a tremendous amount of gardening, we hunt, we fish, and we cut our own firewood, so we don't have to store a tremendous amount of fuel. Someone in an urban area might have to hunker down with a really big underground propane tank, and
Right.
you might have to, you'd have to have a much larger supply of food stored. So it's very expensive. It's a logistical challenge. It's certainly a space challenge, even if you have the money, having the space to store everything. And then it's also a huge privacy challenge, because you also have to conceal the fact that you have all these things. So hunkering down in an urban area is doubly difficult and much more than doubly expensive.
Right, and let me guess. You probably counsel people that are in an urban environment. They go into a situation where I guess you're in, let's say, security criticality, when you know that things could just go absolutely unglued 100%. You probably encourage them to have a contingency for getting out of there ASAP.
Absolutely, yeah. I refer to it as getting out of Dodge. And the modern prepper parlance, they refer to it as bugging out. Everyone needs to have a plan B. And to do plan B right, it means pre-positioning a lot of logistics at your intended retreat location, because you will probably only have one trip out of Dodge, and with just one carload and maybe a trailer. That isn't enough to survive with. So obviously you have to pre-position a whole bunch, and that has its own set of logistical challenges and security challenges, because obviously that has to be watched by someone unless it's completely buried somewhere.
Right.
So it's a whole other set of challenges.
Right. And let me paint a scenario. This is based on the fact that I have relatives that live in Manhattan, in New York City. They assured me, well, we were in good shape because we had good security at the building. And I said, and 15 people ransacked for 8 hours a drugstore downstairs in the same building. So I said, sis, get the heck out of there. Go to Florida and you have another residence there and buy a gun. So, but let's suppose somebody says, we have to get out of Dodge. We're in an urban location like New York, picture Chicago. They have to go through dangerous neighborhoods, or they could possibly go through parts where gangs of people set up kind of like a checkpoint to harass motorists. What do you recommend? What's a maybe not one size fits all regarding escape from an urban area that's dangerous, but what would you recommend regarding firearms and what have you, to be able to get out as soon as possible with a minimum of attraction of attention?
Well, depending on the legalities of where you live, it's obviously very limited in a place like New York or New Jersey. But assuming that they're legal, I would recommend that you would have one battle rifle for every adult and one semi-auto handgun for every adult as a bare minimum. And you'd want a vehicle that's big and beefy and that could, push through obstacles. What I drive is a large SUV with a very heavy-duty deer bumper on the front. And my main concern, of course, is on a day-to-day basis, not having my vehicle destroyed by a deer or elk collision. But if things go sideways, you want a vehicle with a real heavy bumper that's frame-mounted, where you're going to be able to push through obstacles. And it may not just be someone rolling dumpsters out into the street. A regular passenger car can push that out of the way. But if you're driving a heavy-duty SUV with in my case, it's an 800-pound bumper, you're going to be able to push through. You're going to push small cars out of the way if need be.
Sure.
So that's what I would recommend as a baseline. Be armed, be vigilant, and be first. You want to be on the road before the rest of the Golden Horde hits the road. You want to already be halfway to your retreat destination, because you don't want to get stuck in traffic. Just look what happens in Florida every time there's a major hurricane. The highways just get absolutely packed. So you want to have a jump on everyone else and you want to get out of Dodge well ahead of them. so that you can be assured that you're not going to be burning up precious gasoline sitting idling in traffic.
Right. Right. I just wanted to know, there's a Navy SEAL I know, Billy Allman, told me about a little trick. I can't believe that guys from the Army don't know about this one. I'm sure they probably do, or they have it, let's say, at a more advanced level. But he told me about a trick that Navy SEALs learn regarding water, which is fundamental, which you can basically get a clear plastic trash bag, fill it full of foliage, of leaves and what have you, plants, green, of course, not dried, but green. And you put it in there during the day and you tie a knot around it and it precipitates, What do you suggest?
I actually recommend getting 3 different water filters. One is a very compact filter. One of the main brands that's sold is called a Life Straw, and that's designed just for dipping in a body of water while you're out on the trail, and you're drinking from that basically directly. The next filter you would need is a compact water filter that's designed for relatively small volumes of water that you could process through that filter for drinking and for cooking. And then at wherever you have your main retreat, I would recommend a large high-volume filter, and those typically use ceramic filters, and one of the main brands that's sold is the British Birkfeld, and it's commonly called the Big Berkey filter.
Sure,
and
I've seen those.
That's designed to process really large quantities of water. It's a slow filter, but you can process 30 or 40 gallons a day through one of those if you kept it going continuously.
Even if you look at, meetings, get-togethers, expositions where you have other preppers, people have been doing it a long time. What are some of the things that they miss that they should be aware of, but they just fall through the crack?
There's so many things that people overlook. You really run into 2 problems. One is people tend to over-specialize in one area, and they leave out preparation. So say someone who's really into shooting, they'll have firearms and ammunition and all the gun accessories really well covered, but then they typically don't have enough food storage. Or say you have someone who comes from a medical background, they'll have all the first aid gear and all the way up to minor surgery covered, but then they may not have communications or self-defense squared away. So you really need balance. And if you look on my website, again, it's survivalblog.com, there's a link there and in the top bar for what I call my list of lists, and it's an Excel spreadsheet that basically runs down what everyone should cover, and then they need to tailor those lists to their own particular location, to their own stage of life, to their own health situation and their age, that sort of thing. There is no one-size-fits-all list, but my list of lists at least covers all the topics that people need to think through and then tailor to their own situation and their locale.
And so if you look at, it's so basic. Many of the places that people, let's say, want to bug out to, if you want to call it that, even in the southeastern United States, I can think of Florida. I lived in Florida a long, long time. I lived in Miami, and sometimes in the wintertime it gets down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And it goes without saying, if you're in Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, you're going to be facing winter, which brings me to the right type of high caloric content wood. What's the best? Are you a believer in any particular type of wood that you especially like that's useful for, really producing?
For heating? Well, I live in the inland Northwest, and the 2 types of firewood that I like the best that grow in my region are the western larch, which is commonly called tamarack, and also red fir, because those have a really high BTU content per cubic foot of wood. There's a lot of wood like pine that you basically just sit there and watch it burn for entertainment because it really doesn't put out that much heat. It's almost more trouble than it's worth to cut because you expend so much energy cutting it and stacking it and splitting it and then hauling it into your house, and you put it in your fireplace, and it just burns up quickly and hardly puts out any heat. So I'm a big believer in most of the fur species, red fur, white fur, and again the larch or tamarack.
Right, I've heard of tamarack. Regarding spruce, I mean, does that end up producing a creosote problem? That's
I'm sorry, I missed that.
A creosote. That, in other words, that.
Oh yeah, well, that's the other thing. A lot of woods produce too much creosote, and they'll clog up a chimney in as little as 3 months. And that's really a hazard. You definitely don't want to be burning your house down in the midst of a disaster. And you don't want to be messing around on your roof with chimney brush.
Oh my gosh!
2 or 3 times in the winter. So you want to have wood that's produces a minimum of creosote. And again, that's one reason why I like red fir and tamarack. They're fairly low creosote woods.
Right. So it's conceivable that you could see yourself go through 2 winters without having to clean the chimneys?
Close to it. It all depends on what diameter chimney pipe you have. If you have an 8-inch chimney versus a 6-inch, your chances of getting through 2 winters without having to clean a chimney are fairly high. In general, you should, at a minimum, clean your chimney once a year, even if you're burning low creosote wood.
Right. Okay. Well, good. So that's one thing that people, if they do it, they'll be glad that they did. Are there any? Listen, in different parts of the country, we're starting to see a lot of recluse spiders that can be really, really debilitating, if not fatal. Do you have a lot of? Do you see a lot of problems with? Do you ever advise people to store wood in their house?
Most of the problems that people have with insects and arachnids is in the southeast, because there's so many different ways to get bitten in areas like that.
Yeah, really.
Not only mosquitoes, but there's also chiggers. There's scorpions. There's all sorts of different spiders are going to bite you or sting you. And that's one reason I prefer northern climates, because there's less of that in general.
Right.
But you still have to be careful. The black widow spider, for example, is found throughout the United States. So you got to be really careful when you're handling firewood, for example. You always want to wear gloves when you're moving wood or cutting wood, and you got to just keep your eyes open, pay attention to what's going on, and don't get lax in watching for pests like that.
Right.
Another issue, of course, is poisonous snakes, and if you're far enough north and or at high enough altitude, there are no poisonous snakes in the local environs. Like where I live, we don't have any rattlesnakes at all. We're just a little bit too high in elevation for rattlesnakes. And it gives you so much more peace of mind when you're hiking around or working with your wood pile or whatever to know there aren't going to be any poisonous snakes.
Don't you enjoy rattlesnake omelets in your...
Many parts are edible, huh?
In the Army? Didn't you guys learn that stuff in the Army?
I wasn't a snake eater. I wasn't in one of those MOSs, but my officer specialty code was 35 Alpha 5 Mike. I was in combat support rather than in combat arms. But there are all sorts of things you can eat, but I'd prefer not to have to mess with poisonous snakes at all.
I don't blame you. Just wondering though, but what elevation? If somebody's saying, you know something, I want to go to an elevation that's going to be safe. Maybe they have a couple different locations they can escape to. What to avoid rattlesnakes and
generally you have to be above about 3,000 feet.
Okay,
at least in the northern tier states. In the south, you may not. Of course, there aren't that many places that are above 3,000 feet, but you might even have to be a little bit higher, depending. Like places like Tennessee, there might still be snakes at 3,000 feet. But if you get up into the northern states, you're going to have. You can have rattlesnakes in any of the low elevation valleys, but generally the higher elevations, you're not going to have any poisonous snakes.
Right. Okay. Well, let me ask you a little bit about food. Game that you really like. It has a lot of advantages. It offers you a tremendous amount of food supply and keeps for a long time. What if you had your druthers, you had carte blanche to hunt any animal, any game? What would it be, large or small?
Well, my favorite is elk. It's because there's just so much more meat there. You kill one elk, you're feeding a family for a whole winter. To feed a family on deer,
Amazing.
you're talking 6 or 8 deer to feed a family for a winter. So, and in most states, you're usually limited to a maximum of 2 per adult for deer tags. So that's kind of limiting. So if you can, move to an area where there's elk, and generally where you find elk is very lightly populated areas, and that has the advantage, of course, of fewer problems when everything hits the fan. If you look at what's happened with all the urban chaos that's going on, it's not happening in small towns. It's certainly not happening out in farm country or out in the wilderness. It's in big cities. Fewer people means less problems.
Absolutely, right. You're not going to see Black Lives Matter show up in in a small
not
town.
In Podunk. No, they would have a short life expectancy in Podunk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so we look at elk. That's good. Are you a big believer in pemmican? Do you like to prepare pemmican?
Yeah. In fact, fat is one of the things that's really overlooked by a lot of people in food storage, and unfortunately, the food storage vendors, the people that pack storage foods, are partly to blame. And that is, most fats have short shelf lives, and so most food storage vendors pack all foods that have little or no fat. But there are essential fats and oils that you need for human health, and so you've got to plan ahead for that. And if you live in an area where there's bears, you've got fats covered, because there's so much fat on a bear.
Absolutely.
Or if you have neighbors that raise pigs, obviously you've got fats covered. But everyone else, it's going to be tough having enough fat in your diet to stay healthy.
Right. And so about feral hogs and boar, et cetera. So because there are different recipes, but
in places like Texas, in places like Texas or California, there's lots of feral pigs, but elsewhere in the country, there really aren't that many. Depends on where you are. Or places like Arkansas, maybe, or in the Southwest, they have javelina, which is a kind of a native equivalent, small and fierce and a little less fatty, but still plenty of fat.
Yeah, sure.
But if you're going to store fats and oils, what you're going to have to do, unfortunately, is be donating those to your local food pantry once every 3 or 4 years, because the shelf lives are so short. That's really the only other way around it, unless you're going to raise animals that have a lot of fat, or if you're in bear country where you can be harvesting bear.
Does bear grease or bear fat tend to last longer? Does it have a better shelf life?
Well, no. The bear grease has the same shelf life of any other animal fat, but if you're going to be able to shoot a bear basically at any time of year other than the dead of winter, you're going to get around the 2 to 3 year shelf life issue, because you'll be able to get a bear at least once a year.
Sure. Right. And so...
but bear grease is fantastic stuff, and it's multi-purpose. It's used for, in cooking. It could be used to make fat lamps, so you can have lighting. It could be used for lubrication. It really, truly is multi-purpose. You can lubricate bullets with it for hand loading, or for or lubricating cases for hand loading, or lubricating bullets for cast bullets for muzzle loaders. I mean, it's truly multi-purpose.
Wow, and so just curious. I mean, I can understand boars having a lot of fat to offer, but bears. I mean, you get yourself a black bear. Maybe a.
Well, there's one other way around it, and that is to raise emu. Emus have a tremendous amount of fat.
Really?
I've never been quite so greasy as the first time I ever field dressed an emu. You end up with just oil just running down your arms if you skin out an emu. They're incredibly fatty.
I mean, they're in Texas, right? Where else are they in the States? I mean, I didn't.
Well, you can raise emu. I raised emu in Idaho. The first time, that was 20 years ago. You can raise emu in pretty much throughout the lower 48 states.
Right. Well, that's interesting. And that's a bird that.
And they lay 30 eggs a year. So,
oh, wow.
if you do it right, you can have a true self-sufficiency for fats just with emu.
Incredible. And what a fully grown emu, how tall is it? How many pounds does it weigh, roughly?
Oh, they're 50, 60 pounds. They're a big bird. They can also be a little dangerous. So you got to be careful in terms of how you fence them and letting kids into your enclosure, because they can do a lot of damage. Not quite as bad as an ostrich that can kick you to death, but an emu can still, if you get the emu in a bad mood, it's a bad place to be.
Right, okay. Good, that's interesting to know. I mean, do you need much open land for an emu?
No, not that much. And you can, they'll graze, and you can feed them a pelleted feed that you can store in large quantity fairly inexpensively in a fairly compact place. You just store it in 55 or 50-gallon galvanized trash cans, for example, or plastic trash cans. It's fairly compact to store.
Right. So then, just curious about that. I'm glad you mentioned pelleting. Is that let's say a type of machinery, pelletizing machinery, something that you consider?
Pelletizing is actually a little complicated because it's both a wet and a dry process, and the machinery to make pellets is fairly expensive and not that commonplace outside of grain elevators. But if you live in a town that has a grain elevator, especially if you live in the inland Northwest where we don't expect to lose power, you'll be sitting pretty. That's another reason I like the Northwest, is there's so much hydroelectric power that even if the Western grid, the Eastern grid, and the Texas grid all go down, localized power will come back up if you live in proximity to any of the major hydroelectric dams. All those local co-ops will come back up very quickly. They refer to that as islanding their power, and they all have contingency plans to do that. In fact, I talked with one co-op when I was researching one of my novels in New Mexico in the Four Corners area. Right. They said that their power is probably only going to be off 30 seconds if the Western grid were